All right, so this is gonna be episode 8 of Team Profiles for Set G. This is gonna be about Metagross. All right, so Metagross uh, is a pseudo-legendary Pokemon that was released in Generation 3, and Generation 3 is a pretty memorable generation for people who have been playing Pokemon for many years now. People have been following along Pokemon as well. Um, yeah, uh, yeah, you would find that amongst the Pokemon community, Generation 3 is a pretty memorable generation for most Pokemon players. Um, Metagross was the pseudo legendary that came out for that generation, and Generation 3 is what you could call the sort of the introduction to competitive Pokemon. If you wanted to classify a generation as that, right? The generation where they released doubles, because they released abilities in earnest, and yeah, they um, just kind of gave Pokemon a whole new look in Generation 3. And so, yeah, you would find with players that, Generation 3 is generally their, it's not the generation that really cemented them as, Pokemon fans. Then it's probably just their favorite generation in general, right? Mine personally is, Generation 5, but I would definitely put Generation 3 in that top 5 category, right? So, yeah. Um, so kind of, sentiments aside, uh, Metagross hasn't really seen much play, if any, um, in VGC, despite its longevity in the game, right? Metagross doesn't really have an identity as a uh, Pokemon that you can, you know, build around if you want to, play, ladder or even go to an event, right? And it's kind of ironic, as I'm going to explain in this video, that that's the case because Metagross is probably the most consistent uh, pseudo legendary to build around, and it's probably one of the more consistent Pokemon to build around in general. In terms of wanting to just get a litmus test for the format and just kind of get an idea of, um, you know, kind of how you should move forward in a format or in team building or in testing, etc. Metagross is definitely a go-to, right? So yeah, um, yeah. Not to make a long story short, Metagross basically, um, hasn't really gotten an identity shift um throughout the generations. Um, in generation, I believe 6, it got the Mega Stones. You got the Mega Stone Metagross, if I'm not mistaken. And besides that, Metagross hasn't really been the subject of um, any quality of life updates, right? And again, right, being that Generation 3 is probably one of the more memorable and popular generations, may seem odd that that's the case, right? But I'm gonna explain kind of why uh that's kind of transpired, right? So Metagross, basically, if you look at Metagross, right, um, it's basically, it has a very high stats total, right? Being a pseudo legendary, right? It has a very good, base stat. total, right? And not only that, for Metagross in particular, it has very good stat distribution, right? And definitely Metagross classifies a mid-range Pokemon, right? Um, but to also on top of its good stat line, it also has a very good typing, right? So in Generation 3, right? Um, you know, Steel was generally seen as probably the better, if not the best, defensive typing to have, right? And Psychic was seen as probably the best offensive typing to have, right? So putting them together just made for an incredibly, 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 incredibly devastating Pokemon, right? And so, um, it wasn't like a oversight to kind of make the rest of Metagross kind of underwhelming in terms of like its move pool and its identity on the board. It was very intentional, right? So I'm trying to argue that Metagross is a very well designed Pokemon, right? Despite its despite its usage, right, and despite its sort of opinion amongst the community, right? So yeah, again, right. So it has a pseudo legendary stat line, right, and then it has probably the best defensive and offensive typing, right. So what more would you want, right? And that's basically what they were trying to go for in Metagross is that you know, given its stats and its typing, there's already very little you can do against it, right? So why give it something like Swords Dance, for example, right? It would just make the Pokemon not a pseudo legendary. It'd make it quite frankly a legendary Pokemon, right? It would definitely fall into that category of a Pokemon that would need some sort of restriction against it, right? And you also have to consider like Generation 3 as well, right? The only other two pseudo legendaries were Dragonite and Tyranitar. And both of those Pokemon could not even hit Metagross for super effective damage with a stab move, right? Because um in Generation 3, Steel was still resistant to Dark, right? So Dark was still resistant to Steel, right? And so, you know, the two other Pokemon that are in the same category can't even hit it super effectively, right? And so, there wasn't any other Pokemon that had that crazy kind of base set total except for maybe like Arcanine that could really threaten Metagross, right? And so, like, Pokemon was very deliberate in what they were trying to do with Metagross, and that they were just trying to make it a beefy Statmon with a very good typing. That's it, right? And so they've been very, very disciplined in trying not to stray away from that. And so that's kind of why we see Metagross in its state today, basically, right? So yeah, right. So with that in mind, right, when you're trying to build Metagross, you shouldn't be trying to, um, go away from that design, right? It's not something where it's like, oh, Metagross is a mid-range Pokemon, so it needs, something to drop defense, something to drop defense, or something to drop Pokemon's attack. No, Metagross needs other Pokemon that do similar things, or Pokemon that can be facilitated by its beefiness, basically, right? Meaning, Metagross is going to be able to pick a board apart so that a Pokemon that can, you know, really take a tempo can come in and just obliterate the board, right? So that's kind of the direction I'm kind of going for this team, right? So yeah, with that aside, let me just kind of give a rundown of this team, right? So, the core of the team, of course, is Metagross, right? First core Pokemon is Metagross. There's a Fighting Terra, a Solvest Metagross. Has Adamant Nature, 252 attack, 132 HP, 124 defense. It has Body Press, Iron Head, Psychic Fangs, and Stopping Tantrum, right? Clear body, of course, right? And so basically, it's going to be picking Pokemon apart. That's what Metagross does, right? So just give it a whole slew of coverage moves, right? And then you pick Pokemon apart, right? It's as simple as that. Metagross doesn't have to do anything else, right? And then second core Pokemon is Garganacl. It's a flying Terra Garganacl with Citrus Berry. Um, has it's careful nature. It's 124, 252 HP, 132 defense, and 124 special defense, right? And then it's has Salt Cure, Recover, Wide Guard, and Stomping Tantrum, right? So, right, so Garganacl is also another Pokemon that has a very, very good stat line, right? And so to complement Metagross's design, you put it beside another Pokemon that's very similar to it, right? So yeah, so basically what you're going to be trying to do with this board is you're basically going to be trying to set up the Metagross and Garganacl to basically pick apart your opponent's board so that you can bring in your finishers, basically, right? So the finishers for this team would be, Blaziken, right? So Fire Terra Blaziken with Focus Sash, 252 special attack, 252 speed, modest nature, has Detect, Heat Wave, Aura Sphere, and Coaching. Ability is Speed Boost, right? And then you have Palafin, right? So Grass Terra Palafin with Clear Amulet, Adamant Nature, 252 attack, 132 HP, 124 special defense. It has Ice Punch, Wave Crash, Jet Punch, and Close Combat, right? So these are your finishers, right? So you basically want to, have Metagross and Garganacl on the board as long as possible. Now, when these Pokemon come in, they can have an easy time taking over the game, right? So, yeah, alternative, if you're not going to be running the Palafin, right, you're going to have your restricted, since it's set G, right? So, this is Terrapagos, right? Obviously, Stellaterra has leftovers, modest nature, 252 special attack, 252 HP, and has Terra Starstorm, Dark Pulse, Earth Power, and Calm Mind, right? So again, right, another finisher, right? It's generally gonna finisher that you're gonna be using, right? Um, so yeah, that's basically what you're trying to do, right? And then, so yeah, Palafin would definitely fall under a pivot slot because you're generally not gonna want to lead with something besides, you know, Metagross and then Blaziken and or Garganacl, right? So definitely Palafin would be in the pivot slot, but yeah, the other pivot Pokemon is Hydrapple, right? So this is White Herb, Grass Terra Hydrapple as Yawn, Protect, Draco Meteor, Leaf Storm, 252 special attack, 252 HP, has Super Sweet Syrup, right? So, Hydrapple, again, is another Pokemon just like Metagross, where it has a very, very high style line, so it doesn't need other stuff to, compensate, right? And then you run Super Sweet Syrup because then you can just get guaranteed Draco Meteor and Leaf Storm, right? If you like your odds, you can just, give it Regenerator, right? But, Super Sweet Syrup is just a pretty good combo with the Draco Meteor and the Leaf Storm, right? So, yeah. So the reason why I say this team is ironically, one of the least played teams and, arguably one of the better teams to be testing with is because this team is very straightforward, right? It doesn't need, you know, crazy moves that, didn't even exist in Generation 3 when Metagross came out, right? Like, so you can imagine kind of how devastated Metagross would have been, if VGC was as popular as it is now, right? Um, not being able to set up you know, Tailwinds and stuff like that. I don't even think Tailwind was out in Generation 3, if I'm not mistaken. I think it came out Generation 4, right? Yeah. And then, like, Icy Wind, for example, I think was only a single target move, right? And so, um, it was like, there wasn't really, well, no, so Icy Wind hit both targets, right? But Icy Wind was, I don't even think it was a TM in Generation 3, right? So, um, yeah, you have to go to Emerald or XD to get it, right? So you really have to go out of your way to get Icy Wind, right? And again, what Pokemon is going to be able to put an Icy Wind out and, you know, be able to stand up against a Metagross. And plus, it didn't even affect Metagross because Metagross had clear body, right? Like, so you can imagine, you know, if we were to, reverse time, right? Metagross would, be the subject of a lot of controversy. It's just similar to, like how Rayquaza got a lot of controversy in Omega Ruby Alpha Sapphire, right? So yeah, I find it very ironic that Metagross really hasn't had a lot of play in VGC, right? And kind of unfortunate that I haven't been able to be, you know, testing VGC as much as I want to for these last few formats. And so yeah, Metagross definitely is one of my more favorite Pokemon. And so it definitely would have been something that I would have tested a lot and probably would have got a lot of good results from. So yeah, um, it's just yeah, um, VGC just seems very hard to play right now, just due to just how much of a barrier of entry there is, right? So it's like you can't really knock people for not being able to get a lot of value out of Pokemon like Metagross, right? So yeah, this is not trying to bash VGC or anything like that. This is more just to highlight the irony of VGC formats that we've been a part of, especially in Scarlet and Violet, right? Which is arguably the second game in modern Pokemon, right? So yeah, no need to be daunted or stressed out over the lack of testing and stuff like that. It's just you know uh the more we get to play VGC, the better we'll get in terms of formats and variants and stuff like that, right? So yeah, definitely gonna be playing this team a lot. I've already kind of played this team already for the most part. I was playing this in set H a lot. But of course I didn't have Terapagos, so I had to put other Pokemon into those slots. And I think my Hydrapple was a Rillaboom, if I'm not mistaken. Um, but yeah, I already have a lot of experience with this team, and so yeah, I got a lot of good results with it. So I know this team's very good, right? It's just uh, I've been wanting to test other teams, sort of, to just get more insight on the format. Um, and you know, uh, sort of, kind of juxtapose the teams beside Metagross, right? And definitely come to the conclusion that Metagross is probably one of the better teams to test a lot, right? Because you don't want to be just playing teams that have wacky win conditions a lot. You want to be playing teams that kind of are very straightforward and force your opponent to make um, uncomfortable decisions, right? As opposed to playing something like Minior, right, and um, just trying to get like a really lucky shell smash or something like that, for example, right? Um, so yeah, this is definitely a team that you'd want to play a lot of, right? This is like these are the teams that are designed to have a lot of games on them, right? These are like your bread and butter teams, right? So, um, yeah, it's just this format. It just feels with so much irony. So it's just a matter of unraveling the knot that is big VGC, if you want to call it that, and you know putting out good data so that we have better formats and people can win more, right? Because ultimately, if you just get a lot of untested formats, right, and then people who have really just um pitched their tents and are just kind of taking advantage of the untested format, right, then Pokemon's just going to Pokemon's not going to support VGC as much as it does with TCG for example, right? Like you look at prize pools, uh, TCG, despite not being the main game for Pokemon, has a higher prize pool than VGC. Right? The reason I'm ranting this for this video though is because um, I've been wanting to make this Metagross team for a while, and also um, this is the eighth video for this format, and um, I've basically covered all the pseudo legendaries. So now we have a very good foundation for um just kind of getting a grasp of the format, right? Kind of understand the role of the pseudo legendaries, which are probably one of the more important non-legendary Pokemon, and just one of the more important Pokemon in general. Um, Understanding their role in the format, right? So, yeah, I want to just kind of debrief in for these last few episodes, and yeah, just kind of get a bird's eye view as to kind of moving forward, uh, what I want to cover, and yeah, so yeah, it's kind of funny because um, you know, I'm gonna definitely be doing a lot more testing for VGC and TCG for the near future. Um, but again, with a game like TCG, which has a way bigger player base and a way lower barrier of entry, right? We see a lot more testing and a lot more results come out of TCG, and as a result, um, there's not really an argument as to what's the best team or what's the best play or what's the best meta call, etc. Right? For VGC, there's a big discussion as to what that is, right? And that's junior due to how hard of a game VGC is compared to TCG, right? So you have a lot of schools of thought coming in trying to argue one way or another what's the best, right? And I feel like honestly, I found that in this team, right? This is not necessarily the best team in the format. Definitely still have a lot more work to do to kind of narrow that down. But this is definitely the best team to test, right? So yeah, I'm very proud that it's Metagross because again, Metagross is one of my more favorite Pokemon. Um, but yeah, I didn't really realize it was Metagross until I really made this video because um, yeah, I was kind of just shrouded in mystery as to kind of what identity Metagross was supposed to have in this format. Because I was kind of comparing it to other stuff, right? Like, okay, so Metagross, it doesn't hit uh, Miraidon super effectively, right? Doesn't hit Shadow Rider Calyrex super effectively. You know, it's not going to be able to use something like Heavy Slam against Ice Rider Calyrex, right? And then, it gets walled by Incineroar, right? So how can this Pokemon fit in the format, right? And it's not due to its coverage; it's due to its stats, basically, right? So keep that in mind as something to think about. When you're trying to test and stuff like that, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be a jack of all trades. Swiss Army knife Pokemon, right? It can just do what it's supposed to do, and then you can build around that and test, right? So I want to keep this short and sweet. So there's some food for thought, and yeah, this is Metagross. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you in the next video.